The rock whistled past Sarah Wells's head, striking the iron bars with a sharp clang that sent reverberations through her aching skull. Blood trickled from where the previous stone had found its mark, painting a thin red line down her temple. "That's for Catherine Mills, you murdering bitch," Marcus Webb shouted from the jeering crowd that had gathered around the cage in Sagebrush Hollow's dusty main street. Sarah pressed herself against the far corner of the rusted contraption, her hands raised protectively over her face as more stones flew. 3 days without water, 3 days under the merciless desert sun, and now this, a lynch mob masquerading as righteous townsfolk. "String her up," called out another voice. "Save the territory, the cost of a trial." Sheriff Dalton leaned against his office doorframe, arms crossed, watching the spectacle with obvious satisfaction. Now, folks. The law's the law. She'll get her due process." His smile was cold as winter wind. Of course, if she was to die of natural causes before then. The crowd laughed, and Sarah felt the last of her hope drain away, like water through desert sand. They weren't going to wait for Victor Slade to claim her. They were going to kill her right here, right now, and call it justice. That's when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast from the east. A man's voice, sharp with authority, cut through the mob's bloodlust like a blade through silk. "Stand down, all of you." Nathan Holt reined in his horse so hard, the animal reared hooves, pawing air above the heads of the nearest townspeople. In his wagon, 5 daughters sat wide-eyed with fear and confusion, the youngest clutching a corn-husk doll to her chest. The crowd turned as one. And Sarah saw the exact moment Nathan took in the scene, the bloodied woman in the cage, the rocks scattered at its base, the mob's guilty faces. Not Jesus Christ. He breathed, his weathered features hardening into something dangerous. "What in hell is wrong with you people?" Dalton pushed off from his doorframe, hand dropping to his gun butt. "Move along, Holt. This ain't your concern." Nathan's rifle was in his hands. Before anyone could blink, the barrel trained on the sheriff's chest. "Seems to me, when a human being's being stoned to death in my town, it becomes every decent person's concern." The silence that followed was broken only by the desert wind and the soft whimpering of Nathan's youngest daughter. Sarah looked up into Nathan Holt's eyes and saw something she'd almost forgotten existed in the world. A man who still believed in doing what was right, even when it might cost him everything. The mob began to back away, suddenly aware they'd crossed a line no amount of righteous anger could justify. But Sarah could see the hatred in their faces, the promise of violence deferred but not forgotten. And in Sheriff Dalton's eyes, she saw something even worse. The cold calculation of a man who just realized Nathan Holt had become a problem that would need solving. Set up, Nathan Holt had built his reputation on 3 principles: work hard, protect family, stay out of other people's business. The last one had served him well in the 2 years since Martha's death, keeping him focused on the monumental task of raising 5 daughters alone in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. But watching a woman being stoned to death for the entertainment of supposedly civilized people made his gut burn with familiar rage, the same fury that had driven him to fight claim jumpers and rustlers in the territory's early days. Emma, his 15-year-old, spoke with the premature gravity of someone who'd become a mother to her siblings too young. "Why are those people hurting that lady?" Nathan studied Sarah Wells through the bars. Even battered and dehydrated, she carried herself with a dignity that shamed her tormentors. Her dark hair was matted with blood and dust, but her eyes held intelligence and a defiance that reminded him painfully of Martha in her fierce moments. "Because they've forgotten what it means to be human," he said, making a decision that would haunt them all. "You thinking of getting involved?" Emma's voice carried the worry of someone who'd learned to read the signs when her father's conscience wrestled with his practicality. "I'm thinking those people just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Nathan climbed down from the wagon, his movements deliberate, despite the watching crowd. Several men were still holding rocks, their faces flushed with shame and defiance. Sheriff Dalton stepped into his path badge glinting in the harsh sunlight. I said, "Move along, Holt." "And I heard you." Nathan's voice stayed level, but something in his tone made the crowd step back. Still a free country, last I checked. Man can speak his mind about watching innocent people get murdered. Innocent. Dalton's laugh was harsh as a crow's call. "That woman's a killer, Holt. Murdered Catherine Mills in cold blood, then made up stories about Victor Slade to cover her tracks." "That's so. Then where's her trial? Where's her conviction?" Nathan pushed past the sheriff, pulling his water flask as he approached the cage. "All I see is a woman being tortured to death by a mob." Sarah's hands shook as she reached through the bars, and when she drank, tears mixed with the blood on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Ma'am?" Nathan touched his hat brim, then turned to face the increasingly hostile crowd. "Now, Sheriff, you want to tell me what evidence you got against this woman?" "No need for proof when it's common knowledge," Marcus Webb shouted. "She was Slade's accomplice, his enforcer. Helped him control and torment girls until they couldn't take it anymore. Helped him, or forced to help him." Nathan's question cut through the crowd's murmur like a whip crack. Because there's a mighty big difference between choosing evil and having evil forced on you. Dalton's face flushed red. "You questioning my authority? I'm questioning your humanity, and finding it wanting." The words hung in the desert air like gun smoke. Nathan had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. In Sagebrush Hollow, you didn't challenge Sheriff Dalton's authority and walk away unscathed. "Mount up, girls," Nathan said quietly, not taking his eyes off the sheriff. "We're leaving." But as they rode away, Nathan caught the look of pure hatred in Dalton's eyes, mixed with something even more dangerous, the calculating stare of a predator marking prey. Behind them, Sarah Wells pressed her face against the bars, watching her one hope disappear into the shimmering heat. That night, Nathan sat on his porch long after his daughters had gone to bed, cleaning his rifle and thinking about the woman in the cage. The way she'd held herself despite the abuse. The intelligence in her eyes. The quiet dignity that no amount of humiliation had been able to break. Around midnight, he gave up the pretense of sleep and saddled his horse. The ride back to town gave him time to think, to weigh his daughter's safety against his conscience. But every time he considered turning back, he heard Martha's voice echoing across the years. "Nathan Holt, you show me a man who can watch suffering and do nothing, and I'll show you a man who's already dead inside." Sarah was awake when he reached the cage, huddled in the corner like a wounded animal. She looked up as Nathan approached, hope and fear warring in her expression. "You came back." "Couldn't seem to help myself." Nathan dismounted and studied the lock, old iron, rusted from desert storms, but still solid. "What's your real story, Miss Wells? And don't tell me it's just about Catherine Mills." Sarah pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. "There's a man, Victor Slade, rich enough to buy judges and sheriffs, powerful enough to make people disappear. I worked for him once, saw things I shouldn't have seen." "What kind of things?" "The kind that turn girls into ghosts." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He owns Sheriff Dalton, Mr. Holt. This cage, this whole spectacle, it's designed to break me down until I crawl back to him willingly." Nathan felt ice form in his stomach. "And Catherine Mills was my friend, the only friend I had in that house of horrors. When she tried to leave." Sarah's voice broke. "Victor made sure she never got the chance." Nathan had heard whispers about Victor Slade, rumors of a man who treated people like property and had the money to make it legal. But hearing it from someone who'd lived it made his blood boil. "Well," he said, drawing his gun and taking aim at the lock, "I reckon it's time someone reminded Mr. Slade that not everyone's for sale." The gunshot echoed across the sleeping town like Judgment Day. Inciting incident. The lock exploded in a shower of rust and metal fragments. Sarah tumbled out of the cage, her legs cramping from days of confinement, and Nathan caught her before she could fall to the hard-packed earth. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though he could see she was shaking badly. "Then we ride hard and pray to God we make it." But Sheriff Dalton had been waiting for this moment. As Nathan helped Sarah onto his horse, the jailhouse door burst open, and 3 deputies emerged with rifles spreading out to block their escape. "Step away from the prisoner, Holt." Nathan drew his gun with practiced speed, the movement born of years defending his ranch from predators, both human and animal. "She's not a prisoner anymore. You just committed a federal crime." Funny how crimes change depending on who's paying the judge. But even as Nathan spoke, he could see more men emerging from the shadows, townspeople loyal to Dalton, or perhaps just eager to be on the winning side of what was about to become a very short fight. That's when Sarah made the decision for both of them. She kicked Nathan's horse hard in the flanks, sending them both racing down the main street with bullets whining past their ears like angry hornets. They rode through the darkness toward Nathan's ranch, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. Sarah clung to Nathan's back, her face pressed against his shirt, and he could feel her trembling, whether from cold fear, exhaustion, or all 3, he couldn't tell. Why?" she whispered as they rode, her voice barely audible over the thunder of hoofbeats. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" Nathan considered the question, thinking of Martha's voice echoing across the years of the promise he'd made at her deathbed to raise their daughters to know right from wrong, justice from vengeance. "Because," he said finally, "if we don't stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, then we're no better than the ones doing the stepping on." They reached the ranch as dawn painted the distant mountains in shades of rose and gold. Nathan's daughters were waiting on the porch, Emma holding little Ruth's hand, while the others clustered behind them like frightened birds. "Pa," Emma said, her voice carefully controlled. "We heard the gunshots. The whole valley heard them. I did what needed doing." Sarah slid down from the horse, swaying on unsteady legs, as she looked at the 5 girls with something approaching wonder. Ruth, bless her trusting heart, immediately broke away from her sisters and ran to Sarah, grabbing her blood-stained hand without hesitation. "You're hurt," the 6-year-old observed with the matter-of-fact concern of a child. "Emma can fix you up real good. She fixed me when I fell off the roof." Sarah's face crumpled at the innocent kindness. She knelt to Ruth's level, and Nathan could see her hands shaking as she gently touched the child's face. "You're very sweet, but I don't want to bring trouble to your family." "Too late for that," Emma said, stepping forward with the natural authority she'd inherited from her mother. "Anyone Pa thinks is worth helping is welcome here. That's what Mama always said." But Nathan could see the doubt flickering behind Sarah's eyes, the instinctive distrust that came from too many betrayals. When he showed her to Martha's old sewing room, she stood in the doorway like a trapped animal. "I can't stay," she said quietly. "They'll come for me. And when they do, let me worry about that. You don't understand what Victor Slade is capable of. What he'll do to you and your daughters if he thinks you're standing between him and what he wants." Nathan handed her a clean towel and a bar of soap. "Miss Wells, I didn't break you out of that cage just to let you run back into the desert. You're safe here, and that's final." But safety, Nathan quickly learned, was a luxury Sarah had forgotten how to accept. First obstacle. The screaming started just after midnight, piercing the desert silence like the cry of a dying animal. Nathan bolted upright in his narrow bed, grabbing his rifle before his feet hit the floor. He found Sarah huddled in the corner of Martha's sewing room, eyes wide with terror, fighting invisible attackers. Blood seeped from where she'd clawed at her own arms, and her nightgown was soaked with sweat. "Please," she sobbed. "I didn't tell anyone. I swear I didn't tell." It took nearly an hour to calm her down, with Emma making tea and Ruth sitting beside Sarah, patting her hand with the grave concern of a child who'd learned too early that the world could be cruel to those who couldn't protect themselves. "I'm damaged goods," Sarah whispered when the trembling finally stopped. "You should have left me in that cage to die clean. Nobody's too broken to heal." Nathan replied, though he wondered if he truly believed it. His own grief for Martha sometimes felt like a wound that would never stop bleeding. The days that followed established a fragile routine. Sarah tried to help around the house, but her hands shook when she handled knives, and sudden noises made her drop to the floor, as if expecting a blow. She was gentlest with Ruth, who seemed to understand instinctively that this wounded woman needed careful handling. She calls me Mama when she has nightmares. Sarah confided to Nathan one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire. It breaks my heart every time. Ruth barely remembers her real mother, Nathan said. Martha died when she was barely 4. Maybe she sees something in you that she needs. I'm not mother material. I'm barely fit to be around children. That's not what I see. But Nathan's confidence was tested when Tom Patterson rode out from town 3 days later, his face grim with worry. Nathan, you need to hear this. Sheriff's got federal warrants now for both of you. And there's word that Victor Slade himself is coming to collect what he says belongs to him. Sarah went white at the news, her teacup slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter on the porch boards. I have to go, she said, rising unsteadily. I won't let him hurt your family because of me. No, Nathan said firmly. You don't. You don't understand. I understand plenty. I understand that running away won't solve anything except maybe get you killed in the desert. That night, Nathan found her in the barn, trying to saddle his horse with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the straps. Ruth was with her tears streaming down her small face. Don't go, Miss Sarah, the little girl pleaded. We need you here. I need you here. Sarah knelt and hugged Ruth tightly, her own tears falling freely now. I need you too, sweetheart. More than you know. But sometimes people have to do hard things to protect the ones they love. Nathan stepped from the shadows, and both woman and child turned toward him with identical expressions of desperate hope. Running won't solve anything, he said quietly. It'll keep you safe. Will it? Or will it just mean Victor Slade wins again? Nathan moved closer, his voice gentle but implacable. Sarah, I've seen what happens when good people stand aside and let evil have its way. I won't do it again, not even to protect my own. In the dim light of the barn, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and horses, Nathan saw something shift in Sarah's expression. The hunted look faded slightly, replaced by something harder and more determined. If we fight innocent people, we'll get hurt, she said. Innocent people are already getting hurt. The question is whether we're going to let the bad ones keep winning. Sarah slowly began unsaddling the horse, her movements deliberate now rather than panicked. I've never had anyone willing to fight for me before. Well, you do now. Question is, are you willing to fight for yourself? Ruth clapped her hands together, her face bright with hope. Does this mean Miss Sarah's staying? Nathan looked at Sarah, waiting for her answer. In her eyes, he saw the war between fear and hope, between the wounded animal that wanted to run and the woman who was tired of running. Yes, she said finally, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. I'm staying. But even as the words left her lips, Nathan wondered if his stubborn determination to protect Sarah would end up destroying everything he'd worked to build. Rising action. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a nervous boy from town who wouldn't meet Nathan's eyes and rode away fast enough to raise dust clouds. The expensive paper crackled in Sarah's hands as she read, her face going pale as moonlight. My dearest Sarah, how delightfully theatrical your little adventure has been. The heroic rancher, the damsel in distress, the noble sacrifice, it reads like something from those dreadful novels women are so fond of. But surely you must know that every story has an ending, and ours was written long ago. I have business interests in Sagebrush Hollow now, you see. Considerable investments that require my personal attention. Amazing how property values can shift when the right pressure is applied in the right places. I'll be arriving within the week. I trust you'll have made your peace with whatever charity has been sheltering you. It would be unfortunate if they were to suffer for your poor judgment. Your devoted benefactor, Victor Slade. Nathan read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with each elegant word. Devoted benefactor. Like you're some kind of investment. That's all I ever was. Sarah said, her voice hollow. That's what we all were to him. Emma, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with the fierce protectiveness she'd inherited from her mother. Well, you're not his anything now. Your family. But Sarah was already retreating into the shell of fear that had protected her through the worst of Victor Slade's attentions. You don't understand what he's capable of. The things he did to girls who crossed him, things that would make the devil himself sick with shame. Her voice broke, and little Ruth immediately wrapped her arms around Sarah's waist, pressing her face against the woman's skirts. Don't be scared, Miss Sarah, the child said with absolute conviction. Pa won't let the bad man hurt you. Pa always keeps us safe. Nathan wished he felt as confident as his youngest daughter sounded. Over the past week, he'd been making quiet inquiries about Victor Slade, and what he'd learned had chilled his blood. The man owned mines, ranches, and businesses across 3 territories. Politicians danced to his tune, judges ruled in his favor, and men who crossed him had a habit of disappearing into the vast emptiness of the frontier. But Nathan had also learned something else, something that gave him hope. Victor Slade's power came from fear and isolation. He picked victims who had nowhere to turn, no one to stand with them. Sarah might be vulnerable, alone, but she wasn't alone anymore. The first sign of Slade's influence came 3 days later, when smoke began rising from the direction of town. Nathan saddled his horse and rode hard toward Sagebrush Hollow, leaving strict instructions for the girls to bar the doors and keep Sarah hidden. He arrived to find the general store engulfed in flames, with half the town formed into a bucket brigade trying to save the surrounding buildings. Tom Patterson stood in the street watching his livelihood burn, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his weathered face. Tom, what happened? Started about an hour ago. Patterson replied, his voice thick with grief and rage. Right after some well-dressed stranger came through asking questions about you and that woman you're harboring. Funny how these accidents happen right when they're most convenient. Sheriff Dalton approached a set of official-looking papers in his hand, and satisfaction written across his features. Nathan, you need to bring her in. These warrants are signed by Judge Morrison himself, murder conspiracy accessory to human trafficking. Your name, too, as an accessory after the fact. Nathan didn't need to look at the papers to know they were legitimate. Judge Morrison was Victor Slade's second cousin, though that relationship wasn't widely advertised in legal circles. How much did he pay you, Sheriff? Dalton's face flushed red with anger or shame. Nathan couldn't tell which. I resent the implication. Well, now do you? Because it seems mighty convenient that Victor Slade shows up in the territory and suddenly my friend's store burns down while official warrants appear out of thin air. You're walking a dangerous line, Holt. Seems like I crossed that line the minute I decided a human being deserved better than being stoned to death by a mob of cowards. That night, Nathan made his decision. They would have to run all of them. He had a friend, Jim Crawford, who owned a spread near the Colorado border. It would mean starting over with nothing but they'd be together and beyond Victor Slade's immediate reach. The next evening, as they loaded supplies by lamplight, Nathan took Tom Patterson aside. Tom, I need you to do something for me. In 2 nights, when you see fire on the horizon, you get every decent man you can find and ride toward my ranch. Don't ask questions, just come ready for trouble. Patterson nodded grimly. You expecting company? The worst kind. They were nearly finished loading when they heard the sound that had haunted Nathan's nightmares since the war. The thunder of many horses riding hard and fast toward his home. They get the girls to the root cellar, Nathan ordered, grabbing his rifle. No matter what happens, don't come out until you hear my voice calling the all clear. But even as he spoke, Nathan knew they were too late. Victor Slade had arrived, and the reckoning had begun. Midpoint twist. The riders came like a plague of locusts across the moonlit prairie, their torches turning the night into a hellscape of dancing shadows and orange flame. Nathan counted at least 15 men, led by a figure on a magnificent black stallion, who could only be Victor Slade himself. Even at distance, Slade cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair that caught the torchlight and clothes that probably cost more than most men made in a year. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Nathan stepped onto his porch rifle in both hands as the riders formed a semicircle around his house. Behind him, he could hear his daughters whispering prayers in the root cellar, Sarah's voice soft and urgent as she tried to comfort them. "No, Nathan Holt, I presume." Slade called out, his voice cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. "I must say you have exquisite taste in women. Sarah always was one of my most beautiful acquisitions." "She's not your acquisition," Nathan replied evenly. "She's a free woman." Slade's laugh was rich and genuinely amused. "Free? Oh, my dear fellow, I'm afraid you don't understand the situation at all. Sarah belongs to me, body and soul. Has since the day she signed her contract of employment. People can't own other people anymore. There was a war about that, if you recall." "Indeed there was. But debt is a different matter entirely. Wouldn't you agree Sarah owes me a considerable sum, room, board, training, medical expenses, not to mention the substantial cost of the legal troubles she caused me? By my calculations, she'll be working off that debt for the rest of her natural life." Nathan felt ice form in his stomach. This was the trap he'd been too naive to see, the legal snare that made slavery possible again under different names. "She doesn't owe you anything," Nathan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, but she does. Sheriff Dalton has copies of all the relevant documentation, if you'd care to examine them." Dalton emerged from behind the other riders, his face grim but determined. "It's all legal, Nathan. Binding contract of indentured servitude. She broke the terms when she ran off, making her a fugitive from justice." Nathan's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the legal maze that was closing around them. "What about her testimony against you? That was her right as a citizen. Was it?" Slade's voice took on a patronizing tone. "Because, according to the contract she signed, she surrendered certain rights in exchange for my protection and support, including the right to make false accusations against her lawful employer." The words hit Nathan like physical blows. He'd grown up during Reconstruction, had seen the sharecropping contracts and debt peonage systems that replaced slavery in everything but name. He should have known that a man like Victor Slade would have found ways to make such arrangements legal again. Besides, Slade continued conversationally, "I'm afraid poor Sarah may have been less than completely honest with you about the nature of her relationship with me and with dear Catherine Mills." The night seemed to grow colder around Nathan. "What do you mean?" "Well, you see, Sarah wasn't just another victim in my household. She was my most trusted assistant. My right hand, you might say. Helped me maintain discipline among the other girls through a combination of intimidation and, when necessary, more direct methods." Nathan could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath from inside the house. But he couldn't tell if it was shock at the accusation or fear at being exposed. "You're lying," Nathan said, but doubt was creeping into his voice. "Am I Sarah, dear? Won't you come out and tell Mr. Holt the truth about your time in my employ?" The front door opened slowly, and Sarah emerged onto the porch. In the torchlight, she looked fragile and ethereal, but there was something in her posture, a mechanical quality, that suggested someone walking to their own execution. "Hello, Victor," she said quietly. "Hello, my dear. You're looking well. Rustic life seems to agree with you." Slade's voice was warm and caring, the voice of a concerned father speaking to a wayward daughter. "Now, why don't you tell Mr. Holt here about your true role in my household?" Sarah looked at Nathan, and he could see the war raging behind her eyes. Part of her wanted to deny Slade's accusations, but another part, the part that had been broken by years of psychological manipulation, was already surrendering to the inevitable. "Sarah," Nathan said quietly, "Tell me the truth. What really happened between you and Catherine Mills?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands trembling as she gripped the porch railing. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible over the crackle of torches and the restless movements of horses. Catherine was going to run away. She said the words falling like stones into still water. She'd saved up enough money to buy a train ticket to San Francisco. She asked me to come with her. Nathan waited, dreading what came next. I told Victor. Sarah continued, her voice breaking. I told him everything. About her plans, about the money she'd hidden, about the train schedule she'd memorized. She looked up at Nathan with eyes full of tears and self-loathing. I thought he would just stop her. I thought he would find a way to keep her from leaving without hurting her. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant howl of coyotes across the desert. But he did hurt her. Nathan said, his voice flat with dawning understanding. He killed her, Sarah whispered. Made it look like suicide. And he made me help cover it up. Made me write letters in her handwriting. Made me tell everyone she was depressed. Made me... Her voice failed completely. Nathan felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he'd believed about Sarah, everything he'd risked his family for, had been built on a lie. She wasn't just a victim of Victor Slade's cruelty, she was his accomplice. The other girls who died. Slade said with false sympathy. Maria Santos, Ellen Drake, Rebecca Foster, poor Sarah, was present for all of those unfortunate incidents as well. Such a terrible burden for one so young to carry. Nathan looked at Sarah and saw the truth written in her expression. She had been there. She had helped. She had chosen survival over conscience again and again until the weight of her choices had driven her to the edge of madness. Why? He asked, his voice hollow with betrayal. Because I was a coward, Sarah said simply. Because I was alone and afraid, and Victor offered me a choice between helping him or becoming another victim. So I chose to live, even if it meant others had to die. Victor Slade smiled triumphantly, sensing victory within his grasp. You see, Mr. Holt, Sarah isn't the innocent lamb you thought you were rescuing. She's a wolf in sheep's clothing, a killer who used your family's kindness to escape the consequences of her crimes. Nathan felt rage building in his chest, not just at Slade, but at Sarah for her deception, at himself for being so thoroughly fooled. But even as anger threatened to consume him, he found himself looking at the woman who had taught his daughters to sew, who had comforted Ruth through nightmares, who had risked her life to save them from Slade's men. Which Sarah was real, the killer's accomplice, or the surrogate mother? Maybe Nathan realized with growing horror they both were. Of course, Slade continued, his voice taking on a reasonable tone. I'm prepared to be magnanimous. Sarah will come with me now tonight, and I'll forget about pressing charges against you and your family. You can go back to your quiet life, and no one need ever know how thoroughly you were deceived. But Nathan was no longer listening to Victor Slade. He was watching Sarah's face, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. Not guilt or shame or even fear, but a terrible, calculating intelligence, the look of someone who had been playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. There's just one problem with your story, Victor. Sarah said quietly, her voice suddenly stronger and more confident than Nathan had ever heard it. Slade's smile faltered slightly. What's that, my dear? Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out a small silver locket, the same locket Nathan had seen her clutching during her worst nightmares. With steady hands, she opened it to reveal not a photograph, but a small key. Catherine Mills didn't try to run away alone. Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the desert night. She tried to run away with evidence. Evidence of everything you did to us, to all the girls who worked in your house. Evidence she'd been collecting for months. Slade's face went white. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the strongbox she kept hidden in the church basement. The one filled with photographs, letters, financial records, everything needed to prove what you really are. Sarah's smile was cold as winter moonlight. The strongbox I helped her fill, Victor. The strongbox I've had the key to all along. The night erupted into chaos as Slade screamed orders to his men. But Nathan was already moving, diving for cover as bullets began to fly. In the distance, he could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Tom Patterson and the men from town arriving just as Nathan had asked them to. But even as the battle raged around him, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah Wells had just revealed herself to be someone else entirely. Someone far more dangerous and far more mysterious than either he or Victor Slade had ever imagined. Second obstacle. The firefight erupted with devastating suddenness. Slade's men, caught off guard by Sarah's revelation, and the arrival of Patterson's riders, found themselves trapped between Nathan's rifle and the approaching reinforcements. But they were professionals, and they adapted quickly. Burn them out! Slade screamed, his cultured composure finally cracking. I want that key, and I want that woman. Kill anyone who gets in the way. Two of his men immediately began splashing coal oil around the base of the house, while others provided covering fire. Nathan found himself pinned down behind a water trough, bullets chipping chunks of wood and metal around his head. Sarah, he shouted over the gunfire, get to the root cellar. But Sarah had other ideas. Instead of seeking cover, she grabbed a burning torch from one of the fallen riders and began moving toward the barn where Nathan kept his extra ammunition. The girls are trapped in there, she called back. The cellar's filling with smoke. Nathan's blood turned to ice. The root cellar had seemed like the safest place, but if the house was burning above it, his daughters would suffocate long before the flames reached them. He made a desperate decision, breaking from cover and sprinting toward the burning house. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he kept moving. Behind him, he could hear Tom Patterson's men engaging Slade's forces, the battle spreading across his entire property. The kitchen was already filled with smoke when Nathan kicked in the door. He could hear his daughters coughing and crying in the cellar below, their voices weak with fear and oxygen deprivation. Emma, he shouted down through the floorboards. Can you hear me? Pa, came the faint reply. The smoke, we can't breathe. Nathan began tearing up floorboards with his bare hands, splinters driving deep under his fingernails. The cellar door was blocked by a fallen beam, probably dislodged, when one of Slade's men had thrown a torch onto the roof. Hold on, girls, I'm coming. But even as he worked, Nathan could feel the heat building around him. The house was going up fast, too fast. In minutes, the whole structure would be an inferno. That's when Sarah appeared beside him, her dress singed and her face streaked with soot. Help me with this beam, she said, grabbing one end of the obstacle. Together, they managed to shift the beam enough to open the cellar door. Emma's face appeared, first tears streaming from smoke-irritated eyes, followed by the other girls coughing and gasping. Get them out, Nathan shouted to Sarah as another section of roof collapsed behind them. I'll cover you. But as they emerged from the burning house, Nathan saw something that made his heart stop. One of Slade's men, a scarred giant with dead eyes, had broken away from the main fight and was herding the girls toward the woods at gunpoint. Boss wants insurance, the man called out over the gunfire. These little ones ought to guarantee cooperation. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Nathan's rifle from his hands and sprinted after the kidnapper, her earlier fear replaced by something fierce and primal. Nathan followed despite his wounded shoulder, but Sarah was faster, driven by a fury he'd never seen in her before. The scarred man had Ruth, sweet little Ruth, pressed against his chest, like a human shield when Sarah caught up to him at the tree line. Let her go, Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. Don't think so, lady. Boss says. Sarah's shot took him between the eyes before he could finish the sentence. Ruth tumbled free, and Sarah caught her before she could hit the ground. Mama Sarah. The little girl sobbed, clinging to her with desperate strength. I was so scared. I know, baby, I know, but you're safe now. But they weren't safe. Not yet. The main battle was still raging back at the house, and Nathan could see more of Slade's men moving through the smoke toward their position. The woods, Nathan said. We need to get deeper into the woods. For the next hour, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the pine forest that bordered Nathan's property. Sarah proved surprisingly adept at moving silently through the underbrush, while Nathan used his knowledge of the terrain to keep them one step ahead of their pursuers. But Ruth was slowing them down. The 6-year-old was exhausted and frightened, and every few minutes she would stumble or cry out, forcing them to stop and comfort her while their hunters drew closer. Now leave me, Sarah said finally when they reached a small clearing deep in the woods. Take the girls and keep running. I'll hold them off. Like hell, Nathan replied. We stick together. You don't understand, this is my fault, all of it. If I'd never come into your lives, then Ruth would be dead, and so would I. Nathan interrupted. You saved us back there, Sarah. Whatever else you've done, you saved my family. But their conversation was cut short by the sound of men crashing through the underbrush nearby. Too many men moving too fast for them to outrun. And there came a shout. I see them! Nathan raised his rifle, preparing for what might be their last stand, when the forest erupted with gunfire from an unexpected direction. Tom Patterson and 6 men from town came crashing through the trees, their faces grim with determination. Thought you might need help, Patterson called out as his men engaged Slade's hunters. The tide of battle turned quickly after that. Caught between Nathan's group and Patterson's men, most of Slade's remaining forces either surrendered or melted away into the darkness. By dawn, only Victor Slade himself remained wounded and trapped in the ruins of Nathan's barn. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Nathan's house was a total loss, reduced to smoldering rubble and charred timber. 2 of Patterson's men were wounded, one seriously. And Sheriff Dalton lay dead in the yard, apparently killed by his own allies, when he tried to change sides, too late. As the sun rose over the devastation, Nathan gathered his daughters around him and tried to make sense of what they'd survived. They were alive, and they were together, and Victor Slade would never hurt anyone again. But they were also homeless, nearly penniless, and facing an uncertain future in a territory where Slade's influence might still reach them. Emma said quietly, What do we do now? Nathan looked at Sarah, who was sitting with Ruth in her lap, both of them staring at the ruins of what had briefly been their home. Despite everything he'd learned about her past, despite the lies and the blood on her hands, she was still the woman who had saved his daughters. She was still the woman who had chosen to fight beside him when running would have been easier. Now Nathan said, We start over, all of us, together. Climax. 2 days later, as Victor Slade sat in chains awaiting transport to the territorial prison, a final revelation emerged that would change everything once more. Nathan was in what remained of Sagebrush Hollow, arranging for supplies and a wagon to take his family to Colorado, when a well-dressed stranger approached him outside the ruins of Patterson's store. Mr. Holt, I'm Marshal James Webb, Federal Territory Authority. I need to speak with you about Sarah Wells and the charges against Victor Slade. Nathan's blood ran cold. What about them? There's been a development. We've recovered the strongbox Miss Wells mentioned, the one with Catherine Mills's evidence. And I'm afraid the contents are disturbing. The marshal handed Nathan a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Catherine Mills's careful handwriting. This is Catherine's diary? The real one. And according to her final entries, Sarah Wells wasn't just Victor Slade's victim or his accomplice. Nathan opened the journal with trembling hands, reading the entries the marshal had marked. March 15th. Sarah came to me today with a plan. She says she's been gathering evidence against Mr. Slade for months, but she needs help. She's been pretending to be his willing accomplice while secretly documenting everything. The risk is enormous. If he discovers her deception, he'll kill her slowly. March 20th. Sarah showed me photographs she's taken, records she's copied. She's been playing a dangerous game, making him think she enjoys the work while actually protecting as many girls as she can. Maria Santos didn't die. Sarah helped her escape to California. The body they found was a girl who died of fever, but Sarah made sure the authorities thought it was Maria. March 22nd. We've decided to run together. Sarah has enough evidence to destroy Slade's entire operation, but we need to get it to the federal authorities. She's arranged for a wagon to meet us at the old mine road. If something happens to me, if Slade discovers our plan, Sarah has sworn to keep fighting until justice is done. Nathan stared at the pages, his mind reeling. This can't be right. Sarah confessed. She admitted to helping Slade kill Catherine and the others. Did she tell you what she needed to tell you to make Victor Slade believe his victory was complete? Marshal Webb smiled grimly. Mr. Holt, Sarah Wells has been working as an undercover federal agent for over 2 years. The woman you know as a broken victim has actually been one of our most effective operatives. The world seemed to tilt sideways around Nathan. That's impossible. Is it? Think about it. How convenient that she ended up in that cage just as you rode through town. How perfectly she played the role of traumatized victim. How she always seemed to know exactly what to say to gain your sympathy and protection. Nathan's mind raced back through the weeks, viewing events through this new and stunning lens. Sarah's nightmares, were they real trauma or an elaborate performance? Her bond with his daughter's genuine affection or professional manipulation? Her knowledge of Slade's secrets because she was his victim or because she was his hunter? But the confession was necessary to convince Slade that he'd won. You see, we needed him to reveal the full extent of his network to bring all his allies into the open. Sarah's apparent betrayal was the bait that drew them out. Marshal Webb handed Nathan another document. These are the federal charges we're filing based on Sarah's evidence. Human trafficking, murder, conspiracy, bribery of federal officials. We have enough to put Slade and 17 of his associates away for life. Nathan stared at the papers, struggling to process this final twist. What about Catherine Mills? Is she really dead? That's the most remarkable part. Webb said. She's alive. Has been all along. Sarah arranged for her to be smuggled out of Slade's house the night before the supposed suicide. Catherine's been living under federal protection, gathering evidence from the outside while Sarah worked from within. The marshal's words hit Nathan like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about Sarah Wells was a lie, but not the kind of lie he'd feared. She wasn't a victim who had become a monster. She was a hero who had pretended to be a monster to save other victims. Where is she now? Nathan asked. Sarah. She's completing her final report. Once Slade's network is completely dismantled, she'll be free to... Webb paused, studying Nathan's expression. Well, free to make her own choices about her future. Nathan rode back to his temporary camp in a daze, his mind churning with questions and revelations. He found Sarah exactly where he'd left her, sitting by the small fire, helping Ruth practice her letters on a slate board. She looked up as he approached, and he saw something different in her eyes now. The haunted, frightened look was gone, replaced by a calm confidence he'd never noticed before. You know, she said simply. It wasn't a question, so Nathan didn't treat it as one. How long? Since before the cage. We'd been tracking Slade's network for months, but we needed someone on the inside. Someone he would trust. Sarah's smile was sad and wistful. The cage was my idea. I knew Slade would come for me eventually, and I needed to establish a cover story that would explain my capture to his men and my family. Were we just convenient cover? Sarah's face softened, and for a moment she looked like the broken woman he'd first rescued. That part was real, Nathan. Every moment with you and your daughters was real. You weren't part of the plan. You were the best thing that happened to me during the worst assignment of my life." Ruth looked up from her slate, sensing the tension between the adults. "Are you and Pa fighting?" "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling the little girl onto her lap. "We're just talking about grown-up things." "Are you going away again?" Sarah met Nathan's eyes over Ruth's head, and he saw the question there. She'd done her job, completed her mission. She was free to go anywhere, be anyone she wanted to be. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether your pa thinks there's still a place for me in this family." Nathan looked at this woman who had deceived him so completely, who had used his family's love as cover for a dangerous game, who had risked everything, including his daughter's lives, to bring down Victor Slade's criminal empire. She was a liar and a federal agent. She was a hero and a manipulator. She was the woman who had saved his daughters and the woman who had put them in danger in the first place. She was also the woman who had taught Ruth to braid grass dolls, who had helped Emma with her mathematics, who had made his house feel like a home again for the first time since Martha's death. "I reckon," Nathan said finally, "that depends on whether you want there to be." Falling action. The trial of Victor Slade became a sensation that drew reporters from across the nation. For 3 weeks, the courthouse in Canyon Ridge was packed with spectators eager to hear testimony about the systematic brutalization of young women across the frontier. Sarah Wells took the stand on the trial's final day, her federal credentials finally revealed to the public. She testified with quiet dignity about her 2-year undercover operation, detailing how she had infiltrated Slade's organization and gathered evidence while pretending to be his willing accomplice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said in her closing statement, "I want you to understand that every day I spent in that house was a choice between my cover and someone's life. Every time I failed to save a girl, every time I had to stand by and watch suffering I could have prevented, it was because stopping it would have meant losing the chance to stop all of it." The prosecutor painted her as a hero who had sacrificed her own safety to protect others. The defense attorney tried to portray her as a government agent who had allowed innocent people to die for her mission. In the end, the jury saw her as both and neither. They convicted Victor Slade of multiple counts of murder, human trafficking, and conspiracy, sentencing him to life in prison without parole. Sarah Wells was commended for her service, but also quietly asked to resign from federal service. Nathan attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back with his daughters. He watched Sarah tell her story and felt his understanding of her shift with each revelation. She had saved lives, but she had also endangered his family. She had been honest about her feelings, but she had lied about everything else. The complexity of it all made his head spin and his heart ache. After the trial, as they prepared for the journey to Colorado and the new life waiting there, Emma approached Nathan with the directness she'd inherited from her mother. "Pa, are you going to ask Miss Sarah to come with us?" Nathan looked at his eldest daughter, so wise for her 15 years. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Emma said carefully, "that she's been Miss Sarah to us a lot longer than she was Agent Wells to anyone else. And I think Ruth would never forgive you if you let her go." Emma was right about Ruth. The 6-year-old had been clinging to Sarah ever since learning that the woman might be leaving, as if physical proximity could prevent another abandonment. That evening, Nathan found Sarah sitting by the creek that ran behind their temporary camp, staring at the water as it caught the last rays of sunlight. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her on the grassy bank. "I was thinking about the first time I saw you," she replied. "In that cage, when you rode up with your daughters? I thought you were going to be just another complication in an already dangerous situation." "What changed your mind?" "Ruth. When she wanted to give me water, when she looked at me like I was a person instead of a problem." Sarah's voice caught. "I'd been pretending to be broken for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be treated like I was worth fixing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water flow past, Finally, Nathan spoke the words he'd been rehearsing all day. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer. No more lies, no more cover stories. Just the truth." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "All right, do you love my daughters? Really love them, not as part of an assignment or a cover story, but as if they were your own?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "More than I ever thought possible. More than is probably smart for someone in my line of work." "And do you love me?" This time she hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the question. "Yes," she said finally. "God help me, yes." Nathan nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "Then here's what we're going to do. We're going to Colorado, all of us, and we're going to start over. New name, new life, new beginning. But I need you to understand something first." "What's that?" "I can't have any more secrets between us. I can't have any more lies, even little ones told to protect me. If we're going to do this, if we're going to be a family, then we're going to do it honest." Sarah smiled through her tears. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." "Good," Nathan said, standing and offering her his hand. "Then let's go tell the girls they're getting a new mother." But as they walked back toward camp, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. Sarah Wells, or whatever her real name was, had spent 2 years living a lie so complete that even he couldn't tell where the performance ended and the real woman began. He was about to bet his daughter's future happiness on the hope that the woman he'd fallen in love with was real, not another carefully constructed cover identity. It was the biggest gamble of his life, and he wouldn't know if he'd won or lost until it was far too late to change his mind. Resolution and final surprise. 3 years later, Nathan Holt stood in the cemetery of Silver Creek, Colorado, placing wildflowers on a grave that shouldn't have existed. The headstone read simply, "Sarah Mitchell Wells, beloved wife and mother. She found her way home." The name was false. Sarah's real name was Elizabeth Blackwood, and she'd been born in Philadelphia to a family of considerable means. But Sarah Mitchell Wells was who she'd chosen to become, and Nathan had honored that choice even in death. She'd died as she'd lived those final years protecting others. A flash flood had threatened the schoolhouse where she taught, and she'd stayed behind to make sure every child got out safely. The water had taken her, but not before she'd saved 17 young lives. Nathan wasn't alone at the graveside. Ruth, now 9, and still calling herself Ruth, Sarah Holt, knelt beside him, arranging the flowers with careful precision. The other girls stood nearby, Emma with her husband and infant son Mary, with her fiancé Helen and Anne growing into young women who would carry their adopted mother's strength into the world. "Do you think she's at peace?" Ruth asked, her voice carrying the earnestness that had first prompted her to show kindness to a caged stranger. "I think she found peace the day she decided to stop pretending to be someone else," Nathan replied. Everything after that was just her being who she really was. As they prepared to leave, a stranger approached across the cemetery. He was a middle-aged man, with the bearing of a military officer, wearing a suit that marked him as someone from back east. "Mr. Holt, I'm Director Harrison from the Treasury Department. I worked with Sarah Elizabeth during her time with us." Nathan nodded warily. Even 3 years later, he was suspicious of government men with official business. "I wanted to thank you," Harrison continued, "and to give you this." He handed Nathan a leather portfolio sealed with an official stamp. Elizabeth's service record. The real one, not the cover story she lived for 2 years. "I thought you and your daughters should know who she really was." Nathan opened the portfolio and began to read. What he found there took his breath away. Elizabeth Blackwood had been born to wealth and privilege, but she'd given it all up to join the Treasury Department's new investigative division after her younger sister died in a Chicago brothel. She'd spent 5 years infiltrating criminal organizations, always playing the role of victim or accomplice, while gathering evidence to bring down the men who preyed on vulnerable women. She'd saved over 100 lives during her career. She'd brought down criminal networks in 6 states. She'd been wounded twice, nearly killed 3 times, and had turned down promotion and comfortable desk jobs repeatedly to stay in the field. She'd also never told any of her fellow agents about her personal life. As far as the Treasury Department knew, Sarah Wells had no family, no attachments, no life outside her work. She quit, Harrison said quietly, watching Nathan read. Right after the Slade trial. Sent in her badge and gun with a letter saying she'd found something more important than the mission. Nathan looked up from the portfolio. What was that? You. Your daughters. The family she'd never had. Harrison smiled sadly. She used to send reports about her assignments, but in those final months, all she wrote about was teaching Ruth to read, helping Emma with her wedding plans, watching Mary's poetry get published. She'd found her real identity, and it wasn't Agent Blackwood or Sarah Wells. What was it? Mother, wife, woman who chose love over duty. Harrison took back the portfolio. I thought you should know that Elizabeth Blackwood died the day she decided to stay with your family. The woman you buried was exactly who she claimed to be. As Harrison walked away, Nathan felt a weight he'd carried for years finally lift from his shoulders. Sarah had been many things, agent, liar, hero, victim. But in the end, she'd chosen to be just one thing, his wife and his daughter's mother. Ruth tugged on his coat sleeve. Pa, what did that man want? Nathan looked down at his youngest daughter, the child who had first seen past circumstances to humanity, who had offered water to a stranger in a cage, and changed all their lives forever. He wanted to tell us that your Mama Sarah was exactly who we thought she was, Nathan said, and that she loved us enough to choose us over everything else she could have been. As they walked toward their wagon, Nathan felt a presence beside him, not the ghost of loss that had haunted him after Martha's death, but the warm certainty that love once given freely never truly dies. The sun was setting behind the Colorado peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying strangers toward unknown futures and uncertain destinies. Nathan Holt had learned many things in his life, but the most important was this. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not the dramatic gesture or the heroic sacrifice, but the quiet choice to see someone's true self and love them anyway. Sarah Wells had been a liar and a hero, a victim and a protector, a stranger and a mother. She had been all of these things because life had demanded it, but she had chosen to be only one thing in the end, theirs. And that, Nathan thought as he helped his daughters into the wagon for the ride home, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.